Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about rigging in a bit more detail. In particular, I'm going to talk about different ways of rigging a tail. We're going to look at 4 different methods. Rigging just using bog standard forward kinematics or FK, rigging using copy rotation constraints, rigging using IK constraints, and finally rigging using IK spline constraints. Starting firstly with your bog standard FK. So this will be the type of setup you would have. Here's the Ash-Fowl model we're going to use to talk about this. So I've got here the bog standard FK rig. Now FK, as you know, we are simply dealing with a chain of bones. So if I were to rotate this, every other bone along the chain will rotate. If I wanted a curve, I would ordinarily have to rotate each bone one by one, which is fine, but it takes a while. It can be really quite cumbersome when it comes to animating. There are some shortcuts or useful features of an FK rig. The first benefit is, of course, that this is the rig that you'll start with when you are doing your deform rig to begin with, before we're looking at any fancy constraints. So if you have set up and done your weight painting to rig your creature to make your game or deform rig, you've already got this ready to go. The second advantage is, while if we were to grab every bone now and rotate, it moves kind of in a straight line. Doesn't look very realistic. There's actually a really easy way of animating a nice tail swish using FK. If we come up to transform pivot point and we were to change this from once I can click on it, from median point to individual origins, then we rotate, you'll notice we get a much nicer curve, much nicer swoosh as the tail swings. So it's, for most purposes, if you just want a tail that swings side to side as you're walking, that's great. That's all you need. The disadvantages of this rig, though, are firstly that if we want any more complex movements, we're going to have to manipulate these bones one by one. And secondly, we have no control over the extent to which this tail curves once all bones are selected. A kind of solution to that is using the next type of rig, which is a copy rotation constraint rig. So like the previous, we have a series of forward kinematic bones, the default bones, but you'll notice that some of these bones are green. And if we were to click on one of these and go to bone constraints, you'll see we have a copy rotation constraint. The target is the armature, which contains these bones. The bone is tail bone 1, the first bone in this chain. And each of these bones along the tail has the exact same constraint. What that means is, if we were to simply select the first bone in the chain and rotate it, then we're able to control the rotation and cause this nice curve for all of the bones along the chain, rather than with the other rig type where we had to select all bones to rotate them. The nice thing is, just like the previous rig, we can control these bones individually still. One by one we can rotate them, but the real benefit is we can control the extent to which these bones will curve as we move the central control bone. So you notice here we've got quite a nice curve. If we didn't want it to be so strong a curve, we could simply click on bones along the chain and reduce the influence. Let's reduce the influence to 0.5, 0.5 and 0.5 and see how that might look. And it's worth noting, of course, you can't do this with the bog standard FK rig because you've got no copy constraints to reduce the influence of. Now it's set to 0.5. When we rotate, you notice it's a less of a curve, it's slightly more of a straight line, which might be what you're looking for. To set this up, it's super easy. I'm going to go to pose constraints, clear pose constraints to get rid of all of the constraints. Then I'm going to select the second bone along my chain, go to bone constraints, go to add bone constraints, copy rotation. The target will be clicking on the armature. The bone will be the first bone in the chain. In this case, I've called it tail 1. We want this to be add rather than replace, just so we can still move each bone one by one if we wanted to, and we want the target to be local space. Now we've got that set up on one of these bones. How do we do it for the rest? And sorry that I keep switching between object mode and pose mode. That's because if we go to edit preferences, I've got this unchecked. Let's tick this just to avoid that happening for now. Now if I were to select the rest of my bones, so this, shift click this, shift click this, shift click this, and finally shift click the bone with the constraint already on it, the green one, then go up to pose, I can come down to constraints and click copy constraints to selected bones. That way now all of those other bones have the exact same copy rotation constraint, so as before I rotate this, the bones move. Nice easy rig, and it's kind of use case not just for tails, but you'll notice I've got these antennae on this model. If we go to show the bones in this head, you'll notice that the antennae look very similar to the head setup, except they're these circles. These circles are exactly just like this tailbone here. I've just changed their shape to make them easier to use. When I rotate this, which is the first bone in my chain of antenna bones, the antenna move as well. It's the exact same copy rotation constraints, just another nice example of how we might use them. Now, the limitation of this rig is, of course, if we want something a bit more complex than simply the tail rotating, maybe we want a slightly more complex action, then you might need a bit more control over the tail. Otherwise, you're still going to be back to rotating these bones one by one. How do we do that? Well, one way is using an IK rig. That's our next rig. Now, IK rigs are usually used for for arms or legs, but we can use them for tails. This last bone, it's purple just to make it clear what it is my IK bone. With an IK rig, if I grab that bone, I move the entire chain of bones in the tail. I move the entire tail. Now, that's great. It's really easy to get nice quick action. Very simple to move it into whatever pose you might need for animation. But there are problems. Firstly, you'll notice as I move this, sometimes the angles can be quite sharp. Notice there's some almost straight lines in terms of the position the tail is forming. That's easier if I were to quickly turn off the visibility of these bones just very quickly. You notice that it's don't seem to be able to do that at the moment. That's fine. But you notice it seems to be quite, yeah, there we go. Yeah, so you notice that it's quite sharp, the angles. They don't look very realistic for how a tail should be bending. And not only that, but in addition to the sharp angles, you'll also notice that IK bones tend to snap. What do I mean by that? Well, if I'm moving this around, if I move this to certain positions, the tail is just going to snap automatically into a straight line, and you can see that happening just there. You get snapping into this straight line in multiple positions, and that's just not a very realistic look for most tails, at least tails that tend to sway or swing. You can mitigate that to an extent by adding more tail bones to try and increase the curvature. You can add more geometry to your tail, but ultimately this snapping is just the sort of inherent feature of IK, and so either you try and insert keyframes in a way that reduces the impact on your final animation, or you look for a different way of setting up this rig. Just in terms of how we go about doing this rig, if you did want to go for IK, that's nice and straightforward. I'm going to delete my IK bone. Here's then just my tail bones lined up in a chain. To set up an IK bone, I would want to select the last bone in the tail, press E to extrude a new bone, click on that bone, press Alt P, clear its parent, and then let's give it a name. Let's call it tail IK. Now let's go back into pose mode. You'll notice the last bone in the tail is a funny colour. That's because it still has a IK constraint on it. Yours wouldn't if you're setting this up, so yours would look like this. We're going to click the last bone in the chain, going to add pose constraints, inverse kinematics. The target will be your armature, so just click on your bones until it shows up armature. The bone will be your tail IK, which I've called tail IK, and you'll notice it automatically snaps to that bone. Now, chain length is important. Currently, if I were to grab my IK bone, the entire creature is going to move. That's because it's currently trying to affect every bone in the creature, even those you can't currently see. Instead, we want to click back on the yellow bone that has this constraint and change the tail length to 6. That's because that is the number of bones we have in this chain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You notice suddenly it's lined up perfectly with the tail, and now if we grab the bone, it's moving only the tail bones. The rest of the creature stays still. There is a fourth way of rigging. Now, I should say the way in which this bends is influenced by the pole target. I'm not going to set up a pole target for this tail, but if you look at my previous videos on arms and legs, I talk there about setting up pole targets for those. It would work in the exact same way for a tail. But what's the final way of rigging then? Spline IKs. Now, this is my preferred method of setting up a rig. Now, let's go into pose mode. I've got lots of bones here. I don't need them all. I talked in previous videos about how to set up a bone layers, but for now I don't think I've set up any bone collections for these because I'm on the wrong rig. Silly me. Let's click on the right rig, which is not my deform rig but my armature, and let's hide the deform rig. There you go. I've only got the bones visible that I want. You can see that because I've got my lovely bone collections here. Now, I want us to be able to see the FK bones as well. So let's now go into pose mode. Alright, what's going on here? Well, we've got, you can see our FK bones, but the very last bone has a constraint on it. Click on that green bone if you can see it. That is called an IK, a Spline IK constraint. Now, what is that constraint? Well, we can best see this if I quickly turn off the visibility of the FK bones, and you'll notice there's this sort of curve in my tail. That Bezier curve, probably said that wrong, is really important to Spline IKs, because basically what a Spline IK is it takes your bones in your tail and it tries to match as best as it can the shape of that tail, or those tail bones, to the shape of this curve. Now I have a little control here at the bottom, and what that control does is allows me to manipulate the shape of the curve. So if I were to grab this and move it, I can change the shape of the curve. You can see that more clearly if we turn back on those tail bones. Now when we move it, the FK bones are trying as best as they can to change the shape or match the shape of the curve. I can rotate this, it will change the shape of the curve. I can swoosh it from side to side, it will change the shape of the curve. Now the advantage of this is that it is perhaps a less rigid tail. It doesn't snap in the same way that the IK does. It also, that's because it's keeping to the shape of a curve which doesn't have those sharp angles. It also won't snap in the way that the IK would in a straight line. If you want a straight line, you're going to have to very consciously try and form a straight line by manipulating your control bone. But in general, it's a really nice way of getting a lovely smooth curve in your tail. Now, setting it up is complicated. I'm going to show you how to do this on a separate rig in a moment. Before I do that, let's do that now. So I'm going to hide this. I'm going to go to a new rig. This is the exact same model, the exact same rig as before, but this time I've got no constraints set up at all. So the starting point is to add a Bezier curve. How do you do that? Go to Object, Add, and we want Bezier curve. Here's the curve, absolutely huge, far too big for our purposes. So what we want to do is go into, with that curve selected, go into edit mode. And you'll notice that this curve, kind of hard to see, I'm afraid, against a black background, but has 2 points, the end point and the end point. Now, each endpoint has controls, so I can click on this endpoint and I've got these 3 dots that come up. Each dot will allow me to control the shape of the curve. If I were to click on this and grab it, you'll notice that the curve will change shape. In the same way, if I were to grab this, the curve will change shape. If I rotate this, exactly the same. So these are used to control the shape of the curve. Now, how do we take this and transform it into a Spline IK? Well, the starting point is we want to basically snap these control points to our tail. So let's go into snapping. Let's select the let's select the option for vertex snapping. I have had to do this off screen because of what I'm using to record this video is blocking it, but we want vertex snapping, which shows up with these 4 dots. Now let's select the end of our tail, and we want to select all of these control points, all 3. So you can shift click on all of them, or you could, box select all of them. And then using G for grab, I want to try and snap that there to the beginning of my tail. And similarly with this one, I want to try and select them all, which I haven't currently, so because it's such a huge curve. And then press G, and then go to the end. Now, of course, you'll notice that the curve's gone absolutely mad, and that's because it's simply much too big. So if I press A to highlight everything, I can scale to decrease the size of my curve quite significantly. Now, the next step is I want to try and make this curve as straight as possible. So if I were to select this, I can rotate this middle one, try and get it into a relatively straight line. In the same way, I might want to try and rotate this in a certain way to get it a relatively straight line. The important thing here is just try and get the basic shape of a tail. It doesn't matter too much if it's not perfect. This will do for now. Okay, go back to object mode, click on the curve. You want to set origin to geometry. Now we want to go and add our constraint. So click on the last bone in your tail. You won't have anything, so yours will look like this. Add bone constraint, Spline IK. The target is going to be your curve. Now you'll notice that you get this weird kind of stretching. What you want to do is change your chain length to the number of bones in your tail until you don't get that horrible stretching anymore. So for me, it looks like 6 does the trick, and 6 gets me this nice strange shape. Now there are a few options here. We usually don't want to have any scaling. What scaling means is when you change the shape of the curve, the mesh will physically stretch. We don't want that. I'll show you a use case in a minute for when you might want that stretching. But to set up a tail, normally we don't want that. Now, next step is how are we actually controlling the tail? Well, currently, if we wanted to control the shape of the tail, we'd have to, rather annoyingly, go into object mode, hit the curve, go into edit mode, click our controls, and change the shape of them. So here I've got, now a sort of tail shape just by clicking these control points and moving them. That's great, but obviously if you're animating, you want to be able to do everything in object mode or in pose mode, and you want to do that by moving bones. How do we set up bones? To control the curve, that's fairly straightforward. Let's go back into the armature. Let's hit edit mode, and let's simply add a new bone. So I'm going to extrude from the tailbone. I'm going to clear its parent using Alt-P, clear parent. If you have a root bone, you'll want to parent this to your root bone. Now, the next step, it's really important that you are in a certain preference. So go edit, and you want to unclick lock object mode. What that means is you can basically click between different modes. So here I'm in object mode. If I were to click on my curve, for example, sometimes it would switch me back into pose mode or whatever, but you'll see why that's important in a minute. So make sure lock object preferences isn't on. So next we want to go into pose mode. We want to have selected this lovely control bone. It needs to be blue. Next you want to shift and left click on the curve. If you can't see the curve, you can either manipulate those control points so that you could see it, or you could alternatively click on the curve, go under object, visibility, viewport display in front, to make sure that it appears in front, and that way you can see it even through the mesh. So going back to pose mode for those bones, want that control bone selected, shift left click on the curve, that'll take you into object mode. We want to go into edit mode. Now what's happened here is we want to basically select this end point, and I've told you before it's comprised of 3 points. Select all 3, Control H, hook to selected object bone. You'll get this nice dotted line. Now when we go back into pose mode for the bones, now when we grab this bone, we are controlling the shape of the curve, and you can see the curve moving. If we rotate it, we move it, and that's just a really nice way of controlling the shape of the curve. Last problem for us is I've got a root bone set up. A root bone is a single bone I can manipulate to move the entire thing. So here's my root bone, and when I move it, my tail doesn't come with it. My tail gets left behind. Now, of course, if you're animating, every time you move the root bone, you could also try and move the tailbone, but it's not going to work, or it's going to be very, very messy. So to change that, we simply need to parent the curve that we've added to this root bone, and to do that, it's nice and straightforward. You want to click on your go into object mode, click on your curve, shift click onto your armature, go into pose mode, select the root bone, and then Control P, bone. And that's it. Now your curve is parented to your root bone, so when you move the root bone, the curve will come with it. Of course, what's happening is because I didn't parent this control bone to the root bone, the entire thing isn't moving, so let's quickly change that. Let's go into edit mode, let's hit this control, let's shift click on the root bone, Control P, keep offset. Now when we go into pose mode and move the root bone, everything moves, including the tail. It doesn't deform, but then also we've still got that lovely easy control. Lastly, I mentioned I was going to talk about when it might be useful for your Spline IK to stretch. So as I mentioned here, if we click back on my Spline IK, we've got the settings under here for scaling. Now if we were to click fit curve, then what will happen is as we move the curve, the tail will stretch. So if I grab the control bone and moved it, you notice my tail, sorry, it's going a bit wild because I've got snapping on, but my tail is stretching. And that's fine. It's not really what you want for a tail. Maybe for a tentacle you might want it to stretch, but certainly not for a tail. But a use case might be something like a tongue. So here I've got a quite a complex rig for a tongue, but in essence it's just a Spline IK. The curve you can't see because it's hidden behind the tongue, but I've got a control bone for the tip of the tongue, which is here. When I grab that, the tongue will move. Not only will it move, it will stretch to the shape of the curve. And here, obviously, that's exactly what I want because it gives me a lovely smooth movement to control the tongue. I should say, I only set up a control for the very tip of the tail. So if you remember, let's go back to the tail again. I've only set up this control, which controls this end point. But if I wanted to, I could also set up a control for the base of the tail in the exact same way. If you don't remember how to do that, that was go into edit mode, extrude, Alt-P to clear parent, Shift-P to parent that to the root bone, go into pose mode, then we want to click on the bone, that control bone, and then we want to click on the curve. Easiest way is just to hide those a minute. So shift click onto the curve, edit mode, click on that endpoint that will now make sure all 3 points are highlighted. If you haven't selected all 3 points, you won't be able to rotate that control bone to rotate the curve. So it's just easier to have all selected. And then control H, hook to selected object bone. Now, go back into pose mode. Let's get those tail bones up for show again in a second. Go into pose mode. Let's get those tail bones on. Now when we select this bone, we are, oh, I haven't obviously set that up, but you would be able to control the tail. I think that's probably it in terms of different ways of rigging up a tail. Sorry, that last one didn't work out well, but you get the general gist. I, just for the record, have set up using Spline IKs for the tail. I've also got a Spline IK for the tongue. And finally, and maybe one you wouldn't have thought about, was I've also got a Spline IK for the neck of this creature. So if I go into neck, this is my control bone, and this, oh, apologies, this is my control bone, and this is controlling the shape of a curve. And when you've got a long kind of sinuous curve or neck like this, such as for a dragon or another long-necked creature, IKs, again, IK splines are a great way of having smooth curves, smooth movements for a neck without the snapping that you might get for regular IK. Hope that's helpful. Sorry if it was unclear, covered quite a lot of ground today, but any questions, just ask in the comments. Thank you.